Graham Lawson had always believed that a man's home was his castle. After 2 decades of working as a civil engineer, designing systems that others depended on but rarely noticed, he finally saved enough to buy his dream house in the suburbs. It wasn't ostentatious or sprawling, but it was a space of his own, with a generous backyard, a small workshop for his hobbies, and a patch of lawn he could tend to on weekends. For Graham, the house was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of stability after years of professional turbulence and personal loss. Moving to the neighborhood felt like the fresh start he desperately needed. His divorce 2 years prior had left him emotionally raw, and rebuilding his life took more than just buying a house. It meant learning how to find peace again. The quiet cul-de-sac seemed ideal for that purpose. The neighbors were polite, if not overly friendly, and the homeowner association's neatly distributed handbook outlined clear rules for keeping the neighborhood pristine. Graham respected rules he had spent his entire career designing within constraints. As long as they left him to his own devices, he had no reason to worry. The first few months in the new house passed uneventfully. Graham threw himself into small projects to make the house truly his. He built a garden bed along the fence line, planted a few apple trees, and installed solar panels on the roof. He took pride in the yard, imagining barbecues with friends, and perhaps teaching his teenage nephew the basics of woodworking in the shed. There was a serenity to the rhythm of it all, the sound of sprinklers in the morning, the hum of distant lawnmowers, and the occasional friendly wave exchanged with a neighbor. Life was simple, predictable, and exactly what Graham had hoped for. But everything changed one Thursday morning in late spring. Graham had just poured himself a cup of coffee when he heard a loud rumble outside, followed by the unmistakable screech of heavy machinery. At first he thought a neighbor might be having work done on their driveway, but the noise grew louder, shaking the walls of his house. Curiosity turned into alarm as he stepped out onto his porch and froze. There, in the middle of his backyard, was an excavator. A trench was already gouged into the earth, cutting a jagged path through the garden he'd spent weeks cultivating. The apple trees he had planted were uprooted, lying haphazardly at the edge of the yard. His lawn was a ruin of dirt and broken sod. A group of workers in neon vests moved efficiently, marking sections of the yard with spray paint and unspooling coils of thick, black piping. "Hey!" Graham shouted, hurrying across the yard. "What the hell is going on here?" One of the workers, a stocky man in his 40s, turned around. He didn't look surprised to see Graham, but seemed utterly uninterested in engaging with him. "Just doing our job," he said, shrugging. "This is my property," Graham snapped, gesturing at the destruction. "You can't just dig up my yard without permission." "Talk to the HOA," the worker replied flatly before turning back to his colleagues. Graham's heart raced as he stormed inside to find the HOA contact information. He remembered flipping through the handbook when he first moved in, but the section on infrastructure improvements had seemed innocuous at the time. He hadn't paid it much mind, assuming it involved repaving streets or fixing streetlights. Now, he frantically searched for the emergency contact number listed at the back of the booklet. It took 3 calls before someone finally answered. The woman on the other end sounded detached, almost bored, as Graham explained the situation. Her response chilled him. "Yes, Mr. Lawson," she said. "The HOA authorized the work as part of our community-wide flood mitigation plan. You should have received notice in the mail last month." "I didn't get any notice," Graham said, his voice rising. "And even if I had, this is my property. You can't just dig here without my consent." "It's outlined in the bylaws," the woman replied smoothly. "The HOA has the authority to conduct improvements that benefit the neighborhood as a whole. The trenching is part of Phase 2 of the drainage upgrade. You'll receive an itemized bill once the work is complete." "An itemized bill?" Graham repeated, incredulous. "You're charging me for this?" "Of course," she said, as though it were the most reasonable thing in the world. "The costs are divided among affected properties. This project ensures that everyone benefits from reduced flood risk. If you have concerns, you can bring them up at the next board meeting." The call ended before Graham could gather his thoughts. He stared at his phone, his mind reeling. Charging him for destroying his yard. No notice, no consultation, just a bill for a problem he didn't even know existed. For the rest of the day, Graham watched helplessly as the workers continued their excavation. He tried speaking to the foreman again, but the man simply referred him back to the HOA. By evening, the trench stretched nearly the entire length of his property, snaking dangerously close to the foundation of his home. That night, as he sat in his living room surrounded by papers and the HOA handbook, Graham's frustration deepened into something more potent: resolve. He wouldn't let this stand. The HOA might think they could trample over him, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. For years, Graham had designed projects like this, analyzing soil composition, calculating load tolerances, and drafting drainage systems. He knew the rules better than anyone, and he knew when someone was bending them. If the HOA wanted to play games, they'd soon discover they were up against a man who had spent his life mastering them. Graham spent the better part of the night poring over the HOA bylaws, looking for any clause that could justify what had been done to his property. Page after page, he searched for an explanation, but all he found was vague language. The HOA retains the right to approve and conduct neighborhood-wide improvements in the interest of safety and community welfare. Nothing specific. Nothing that could explain why they targeted his backyard for this so-called flood mitigation project. He double-checked his mail pile, flipping through unopened envelopes and old flyers, but there was no notice, no warning, just silence, until the roar of machinery broke it. The next morning, Graham attended the HOA's office hours in person. Their headquarters was housed in a nondescript building near the strip mall on the edge of town. The lobby smelled faintly of stale coffee, and a receptionist with an impenetrable smile greeted him. "I need to speak to someone about the excavation on my property," he said, keeping his tone measured. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No, I don't have an appointment," Graham said tightly, "because I wasn't given any warning that my backyard was going to be turned into a construction site." The receptionist's smile didn't waver. She typed something into her computer and said, "Let me see if Mr. Harper is available. He's the HOA president." Graham was shown into a conference room with beige walls and a table that was far too large for the space. A few moments later, Douglas Harper entered. He was tall, with the kind of practiced affability that felt hollow. His handshake was firm but brief, his eyes scanning Graham like he was already calculating how much of a problem this would be. "Mr. Lawson," Harper said, taking a seat across the table, "I understand you're here about the flood mitigation work." "Flood mitigation," Graham said, unable to hide his irritation. "Let's call it what it is. A trench running through my property without my consent. I didn't receive any notice, I wasn't consulted, and now I'm being told I'll be billed for the damage." Harper sighed, a well-rehearsed expression of bureaucratic patience crossing his face. "I understand your frustration, but this project was voted on by the HOA board months ago. It's part of a larger initiative to prevent flooding in the neighborhood. Surely you've noticed the issues we've had during heavy rains." "I've lived here for 3 months," Graham shot back. "And no, I haven't noticed any issues. My property hasn't flooded once. So why is my backyard being torn apart?" Harper folded his hands on the table. "The trench runs along a natural drainage path identified in the original development plans for this area. It was the most efficient route for the upgrade." Graham narrowed his eyes. "Efficient for whom? Because it's certainly not efficient for me. And why wasn't I notified?" "You should have received a letter," Harper said, his tone cooling slightly. "We sent notices to all affected homeowners." "I didn't receive one," Graham said flatly. Harper shrugged. "I can't speak to that. Perhaps there was an error in the mailing list." Graham's frustration bubbled over. "An error? That's your explanation for why my property was destroyed without my knowledge. And now you expect me to pay for it." "The costs are shared among affected properties," Harper said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "This is a community effort, Mr. Lawson. Everyone benefits from improved drainage." "I don't see how I'm benefiting from a giant hole in my yard," Graham retorted. The two men locked eyes for a tense moment before Harper leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to one of polite dismissal. "If you feel this strongly about it, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. The board will review it at the next meeting." "And in the meantime?" Graham asked. "The work will continue as scheduled," Harper said with finality. Graham left the office fuming. Harper had been so calm, so calculated, as though this were just another routine matter for the HOA to brush aside. But Graham wasn't going to let it go. He didn't trust Harper's assurances, and he certainly didn't believe that the trench was about flood mitigation. The whole thing reeked of something larger, something hidden just beneath the surface literally and figuratively. Determined to dig deeper, Graham began asking his neighbors about the project. Most of them seemed uneasy, reluctant to say much beyond vague platitudes about trusting the HOA. One older woman, Mrs. Everett, admitted that she'd received a notice about the project weeks ago, but had ignored it, assuming it wouldn't affect her. Another neighbor, a man in his 60s named Tom, said he'd seen workers surveying the area late at night, but hadn't thought much of it. "The thing is," Tom said, lowering his voice, "you're not the first. They've done this before. A few years ago, it was the front yards on Pine Street. Claimed it was for sidewalk repairs, but the sidewalks didn't need fixing, and the bills they sent out afterward were through the roof." "What happened then?" Graham asked. Tom shrugged. "People paid. What else could they do?" That evening, Graham stood at the edge of the trench, staring down into the chaos of dirt and debris. He could see the black piping partially buried at the bottom, running parallel to his house. The sight filled him with a mix of anger and unease. This wasn't just about drainage. There was something else going on here, and he intended to find out what. The next morning, Graham called the contractor listed on the sign posted near the excavation site. After being transferred several times, he finally reached someone willing to talk. The man on the other end was hesitant, but Graham's persistence paid off. "All I can tell you," the contractor said, "is that we're following the HOA's instructions. They gave us the specs, and we're just doing the job we were hired for." "What kind of specs?" Graham pressed. "Look, I don't want to get in trouble," the contractor said, "but it's not just drainage. There's more to it than that. You didn't hear it from me, but they're laying conduit. Big stuff, way bigger than what you'd need for stormwater. Conduit." The word hit Graham like a punch to the gut. Conduit wasn't for water, it was for utilities. Electricity, fiber optics, maybe even something more industrial. But why would the HOA need conduit that large? And why were they burying it under residential properties? Graham's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He was no stranger to infrastructure projects. He'd overseen enough of them in his career to recognize when something didn't add up. Whatever the HOA was doing, it wasn't just about preventing floods. Armed with this new information, Graham returned to his HOA handbook, combing through it for any hint of authorization for this kind of work. The bylaws were vague as ever, but one line stood out: all infrastructure projects must be approved by a majority vote of the board. A majority vote. That was the key. If the board hadn't followed their own rules, the entire project could be invalidated. But proving that would require more than speculation, it would require evidence. And Graham knew exactly where to start looking. Graham wasted no time after his discovery about the conduit. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and what he saw didn't just concern him, it infuriated him. He wasn't simply dealing with an overzealous HOA project. He was facing what looked like a deliberate overreach, perhaps even something illegal. But Graham knew better than to confront the board again without solid evidence. He needed to build a case they couldn't dismiss with bureaucratic hand-waving. His first step was the county records office. If this trench and the oversized conduit were part of any legitimate infrastructure upgrade, there would be permits, approvals, and possibly environmental assessments. Graham took a day off work to make the trip downtown, determined to dig into the paper trail. The clerk at the records office, a middle-aged man named Paul, greeted Graham with mild curiosity. "Looking for anything specific?" Paul asked as Graham explained he was a homeowner searching for details about the drainage project affecting his property. "HOA work." Paul raised an eyebrow. "We don't get a lot of permit requests from HOAs for projects that big. Usually it's just minor stuff, tree trimming, street repairs." "That's what I thought," Graham said. "But this isn't minor. They're digging a trench large enough to fit industrial conduit, and I've got no idea why." Paul nodded and led him to a workstation with access to the county's permit database. "Let's see what we can find." For the next hour, Paul and Graham combed through records. They found a permit filed under the HOA's name for Phase 2 drainage improvements, but the details were thin. The application described the work as routine flood mitigation and included a schematic of the trench that looked far too simplistic to be accurate. No mention of conduit, no detailed plans for what was being installed, just a generic justification about community safety. "This doesn't match what's on the ground," Graham said, frowning at the screen. "The trench is at least twice the size of what this diagram shows." Paul squinted at the file. "That's odd. If the scope of the project changed after the permit was approved, they'd be required to file an amendment. Let me check." He typed in a few more commands, and after a moment his brow furrowed. Nothing. No amendments, no secondary permits. Graham's pulse quickened. So what does that mean? They're doing unauthorized work. "It's starting to look that way," Paul admitted. "But without seeing the actual work order or contract, it's hard to say. If they've gone off the books, though, that's a big problem." Graham thanked Paul for his help and left the office with copies of the permit and schematic. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He knew he needed more than just discrepancies in paperwork. He needed proof that the HOA was deliberately hiding something. That night, Graham went back to the trench with a flashlight and a notebook. The workers had left for the day, and the site was eerily quiet. He stepped carefully along the edge of the excavation, studying the conduit that had been partially buried at the bottom. It was thick, reinforced with steel sheathing, and far too large for any residential flood control system he'd ever seen. Kneeling down, he traced the path of the conduit with his light. About 10 feet ahead, it disappeared into the side of the trench, running under the property line toward the neighboring lot. Graham's suspicion deepened. This wasn't just an isolated installation, it was part of something much larger. The next day, he began talking to more neighbors, this time focusing on those whose properties were directly affected. Most of them seemed resigned, unwilling to challenge the HOA, but one woman, Linda, who lived 2 houses down, was furious. "They've been at this for weeks," Linda said when Graham knocked on her door. "Tore up half my yard, knocked down my fence, and now they're billing me for it. I told them to shove their invoice where the sun doesn't shine." "Did they give you any explanation?" Graham asked. "Same crap they probably told you," Linda replied. "Flood mitigation. Like I haven't lived here 20 years without a single flood." She crossed her arms. "Why? You think they're up to something?" Graham hesitated. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but Linda seemed like someone who could handle the truth. "I think there's more to this than they're letting on," he said carefully. "Have you noticed anything unusual about the materials they're using?" "The size of the conduit." Linda frowned. "Now that you mention it, yeah. I thought it was weird they're burying stuff that big. What the hell does stormwater need steel piping for?" "I don't think it's for stormwater," Graham said. Linda's eyes narrowed. "Then what is it for?" "I'm trying to figure that out," he admitted. "But I can't do it alone. If you're willing, I could use your help." Over the next few days, Graham and Linda began working together, gathering as much information as they could. Linda spoke to other neighbors while Graham focused on the technical side, mapping the path of the trench and documenting the materials being used. Together, they pieced together a troubling pattern. The trench wasn't just running through their properties, it was part of a network that extended across the entire neighborhood, connecting at strategic points that didn't seem random. Things escalated further when Graham received an official letter from the HOA. The tone was curt and unapologetic, stating that any interference with the construction would result in penalties, including fines and potential legal action. It was a blatant attempt to intimidate him into compliance, but it only strengthened his resolve. The final straw came when Linda called him one evening, her voice tense. "Graham, you need to see this." He arrived at her house within minutes. Linda led him to the back of her property, where the trench had been partially filled in, but something was sticking out of the dirt, a section of the conduit, damaged during the backfill. Graham knelt down to examine it and froze. The conduit wasn't just steel reinforced, it was labeled. Faint but unmistakable, the words Hazmat Protocol were stamped along the side, along with a serial number that didn't look like it belonged to be any standard utility company. "This isn't a drainage project," Graham said, his voice low. Linda stared at him. "Then what the hell is it?" Graham didn't have an answer. But he knew one thing for certain. The HOA wasn't just overstepping, they were hiding something dangerous. And he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. Graham sat in his living room late into the night, staring at the photographs he had taken of the conduit in Linda's yard. The words Hazmat protocol loomed in his mind, refusing to fade. Whatever the HOA was burying, it wasn't just oversized drainage piping, it was something that required specialized handling. But why would they install hazardous material infrastructure in a residential neighborhood? And why go to such lengths to hide it? The possibilities churned in his mind, none of them reassuring. Graham knew he needed help, but going to local authorities without concrete evidence could backfire. If the HOA caught wind of his suspicions, they might shut the entire operation down or worse, accelerate it before anyone could intervene. He decided to take the next step on his own terms, using the skills and knowledge that had defined his career. The following morning, he returned to the trench with a plan. Dressed in his old work boots and carrying a surveyor's kit he'd kept since his engineering days, Graham set to work measuring the excavation. He charted the dimensions of the trench, noting the precise width, depth, and trajectory. The HOA might claim this was a simple flood control system, but Graham knew the numbers wouldn't lie. The size of the trench far exceeded the needs of a residential drainage system, even accounting for future rainfall projections. He spent hours documenting the site, taking detailed notes and snapping photographs from multiple angles. As he worked, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: small orange flags staked into the ground at intervals along the trench. Each flag bore a handwritten code that seemed to correspond to specific points on a map. Graham frowned, realizing these markers weren't placed at random. They were part of a larger grid, carefully planned and methodically executed. That evening, Graham reviewed his findings in his makeshift home office. He overlaid the map of the trench with the schematic he'd obtained from the county records office, searching for discrepancies. It didn't take long to find them. The trench deviated significantly from the approved plans, cutting through private property in ways that weren't even hinted at in the original permit. The real breakthrough came when he cross-referenced the serial number on the damaged conduit with an industrial database he still had access to from his engineering days. After hours of searching, he found a match. The conduit was classified as high-capacity utility piping, typically used for transporting industrial chemicals, pressurized gases, or even waste materials. It was the kind of infrastructure you'd find in a chemical plant or manufacturing facility, not a suburban neighborhood. Graham's hands tightened around the edge of his desk as the implications sank in. Whatever the HOA was installing, it wasn't just illegal, it could pose a direct threat to the residents of the neighborhood. He felt a surge of anger and determination. They were gambling with people's safety, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. The next step was riskier, but Graham knew it was necessary. He reached out to Linda and explained what he had found. She listened intently, her initial skepticism giving way to grim resolve. Together, they decided to inspect the trench further before confronting the HOA. Late one evening, armed with flashlights and a borrowed utility camera, Graham and Linda made their way back to the trench. The workers had finished for the day, leaving the site quiet and undisturbed. They climbed down carefully, their movements deliberate and precise. Graham positioned the camera at the mouth of the conduit, feeding it through the narrow opening to see where it led. The camera's feed displayed on a small handheld screen, showing the interior of the conduit as it extended deep into the earth. Graham and Linda watched in tense silence as the camera revealed a network of pipes branching off in multiple directions, far more extensive than they had imagined. Some sections appeared reinforced with additional plating, while others showed signs of recent welding. "What the hell is this?" Linda whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It's not drainage, that's for sure," Graham muttered. As the camera continued its journey, it suddenly hit an obstruction, a sealed hatch embedded in the conduit. Graham adjusted the camera's angle, trying to get a clearer view. The hatch was marked with a faded symbol, a triangle enclosing a series of concentric circles. It wasn't a logo Graham recognized, but its presence sent a shiver down his spine. "This goes deeper than just the HOA," he said quietly. "Someone else is involved." The two of them retreated from the trench, their minds racing with questions. Who had authorized this project? What was the purpose of the hatch? And why was the HOA so determined to keep it hidden? Graham decided it was time to confront the whole board directly. Armed with his findings, he attended the next public meeting, which was held in the neighborhood community center. The room was small but crowded, filled with homeowners discussing minor issues like lawn maintenance and parking regulations. Graham waited patiently for his turn to speak, his stack of documents tucked under his arm. When he was finally called to the podium, he wasted no time. "I'm here to talk about the trench running through my property," he began, his voice calm but firm. Douglas Harper, seated at the head of the table, gave him a tight smile. "We've already addressed this, Mr. Lawson. The project is—" "With all due respect, you haven't addressed anything," Graham interrupted. "You fed us vague explanations and refused to provide transparency. But I've done my own investigation, and I've found things that don't add up." The room grew quiet as Graham laid out his findings. He presented the discrepancies between the approved schematic and the actual trench, the industrial classification of the conduit, and the existence of the sealed hatch. "This isn't about flood control," Graham said, his voice rising. "This is something else entirely, and I think everyone here deserves to know what's really going on." Harper's expression darkened. "Mr. Lawson, I'd advise you to tread carefully. Making baseless accusations against the HOA serves no one." "These aren't baseless accusations," Graham shot back, holding up a photograph of the damaged conduit. "This is evidence. If you won't answer my questions, maybe the county inspector's office will." Harper's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The other board members avoided Graham's gaze, their silence speaking volumes. It was clear they weren't prepared to deal with someone who wouldn't be intimidated. As Graham left the meeting, he felt a mix of victory and unease. He had forced the HOA into a corner, but he knew they wouldn't back down easily. Whatever they were hiding, it was big enough to make them desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. The following day, Graham received an anonymous note in his mailbox. The message was short and chilling. "Stop asking questions. You don't know what you're getting into." Graham crumpled the note in his hand, his resolve hardening. He didn't know who had sent it, but he wasn't going to stop. If anything, the threat only confirmed what he already suspected. He was onto something, and the people behind it were afraid of being exposed. With Linda's help, he began preparing for the next stage of his investigation. Whatever it took, he was going to uncover the truth, and he wasn't going to let the HOA, or anyone else, stop him. The note in Graham's mailbox didn't have its intended effect. If the anonymous sender thought they could scare him into silence, they were mistaken. It only deepened his resolve to get to the bottom of whatever the HOA was hiding. He wasn't just protecting his own property now, this was about the entire neighborhood. And if the conduit truly posed a threat, then ignoring it would put everyone at risk. Graham couldn't live with that. The next day, Graham met with Linda at her house. She had been just as rattled by the discoveries in the trench and was eager to help. They spread their findings across her dining table: maps of the trench network, photos of the conduit, notes on the permit discrepancies, and sketches of the mysterious hatch. "This isn't just about money," Linda said, staring at the evidence. "Whatever they're doing, it's big, and they're counting on us not asking questions." "They're making a mistake," Graham replied, "because I'm going to keep asking until I get answers." They decided to take their investigation a step further. Graham suggested they trace the trench beyond the residential properties to see where it led. If it connected to a larger network, that might reveal its true purpose. Linda volunteered to join him, and they set out later that evening, armed with flashlights, notebooks, and a portable GPS device to map their progress. Starting from Graham's backyard, they followed the trench along its path through the neighborhood. At first, it seemed to wind aimlessly, cutting through yards and vacant lots. But as they mapped the trajectory, a pattern emerged. The trench wasn't random, it was converging on a single location, a fenced-off lot on the far edge of the neighborhood. The lot was one Graham had noticed before, but never paid much attention to. It was marked with a weathered sign reading "Private Property, No Trespassing," and the fence was topped with rusting barbed wire. Through the gaps in the fence, they could see a small structure that looked like an abandoned utility shed. "This is it," Linda said, her voice hushed. "The trench leads right here." Graham nodded. "And that shed probably isn't just a shed." They circled the lot, searching for a way in, but the gate was padlocked, and the fence was sturdy despite its age. Graham noted the location on his GPS and took a few photos before they retreated. Breaking in wasn't an option yet. The next morning, Graham tried to pull up records for the fenced lot. He dug through county property databases and municipal zoning maps, but found nothing useful. The lot wasn't listed under the HOA or any local business. In fact, it wasn't listed at all. It was as if the property didn't officially exist. This discovery raised even more questions. Who owned the lot? Why wasn't it recorded in public databases? And what was its connection to the trench? Later that day, Linda called with an update. She'd spoken to a few neighbors who had lived in the area for decades. One of them, an elderly man named Walter, claimed the lot used to belong to an industrial company that had gone out of business years ago. They used to manufacture chemicals, Linda said, relaying Walter's story. Something happened, an accident, maybe, and they shut everything down. The land's been empty ever since. Chemicals, Graham repeated, his stomach tightening. That fit with the hazmat markings on the conduit. Could the HOA be using the trench to connect to something buried on that lot? As the pieces of the puzzle came together, Graham's frustration grew. He felt like he was circling the truth, but couldn't quite grasp it. And time was running out. The trench was nearly complete, and once the workers finished burying the conduit, it would be much harder to prove what was going on. That evening, Graham decided to confront one of the contractors working on the trench. He waited until the crew was wrapping up for the day and approached a younger worker who seemed less guarded than the others. "Hey," Graham called out. "Got a minute?" The worker hesitated but eventually walked over. "What's up?" "I've been trying to figure out what this project is really about," Graham said, keeping his tone casual. "The HOA says it's for drainage, but I've been around enough construction sites to know that's not true." The worker's expression flickered with unease. "Look, man, I just do what I'm told. They don't tell us much, anyway." "Maybe," Graham said, lowering his voice. "But you've seen the conduit. You've seen what's inside. You really think this is about stormwater?" The worker shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "I don't know what it's for." "Okay, but I can tell you one thing, they're paying us extra to keep our mouths shut. And not just about what we're doing, but about what we've found." Graham's pulse quickened. "What you found?" The worker hesitated, then muttered, "Stuff buried down there. Old stuff. Pipes, tanks, maybe even foundations. They don't want anyone asking questions." Before Graham could press further, the foreman shouted for the crew to pack up, and the worker quickly walked away. Graham watched him go, his mind racing. That night, Graham and Linda regrouped to discuss their next move. The workers' comment about old stuff buried underground confirmed their suspicions that the trench was connected to the lot's industrial past. But proving it would require more than anecdotal evidence. "We need to get inside that lot," Linda said. "That's where the answers are." Graham agreed, but they both knew it wouldn't be easy. The fenced property was off limits, and any attempt to break in would be risky. Still, the thought of doing nothing wasn't an option. The following night, they returned to the lot, this time armed with bolt cutters and a plan. They waited until the streets were quiet, then slipped through the shadows to the fence. Graham cut the padlock while Linda kept watch, her flashlight switched off to avoid drawing attention. Once inside, they approached the shed, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. Up close, the structure looked even more decrepit, its metal walls streaked with rust. Graham tried the door, but it was locked. He pulled out a crowbar and pried it open, the metal shrieking in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay and chemicals. The shed was filled with rusting equipment and faded warning signs, many of which bore the same triangular symbol Graham had seen on the hatch in the conduit. At the center of the room was a trap door, partially concealed under a rotting tarp. "This is it," Graham said, his voice hushed. Linda crouched beside him as he lifted the trap door, revealing a set of metal stairs descending into darkness. They exchanged a tense glance before Graham pulled out his flashlight and began to descend, Linda following close behind. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a narrow tunnel lined with reinforced walls. The air was damp and carried a faint hum, as though machinery were still operating somewhere deep below. Graham's flashlight illuminated faded labels on the wall's codes and markings that hinted at the tunnel's original purpose, but offered no clear answers. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, they stumbled upon a chamber filled with massive tanks connected by pipes. The tanks were old, their surfaces corroded, but a few still bore warning labels, "Toxic handle with extreme caution." "This isn't just leftover equipment," Linda said, her voice trembling. "It's active." Graham's stomach turned. Whatever the HOA was doing, it wasn't just illegal, it was dangerous. And now they were more certain than ever that they had to stop it. The discovery in the underground chamber left Graham and Linda shaken but resolute. The tanks weren't relics of a bygone industrial era, they were still functional, still connected to something bigger, and whatever was in them posed a serious danger. Toxic chemicals, perhaps, or worse. The HOA wasn't just covering up a sloppy infrastructure project, they were actively facilitating something hazardous beneath their neighborhood. The walk back to their homes was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they finally parted, Linda whispered, "We need to end this, Graham, before someone gets hurt." "I know," he replied. "And I think I know how." Graham spent the next day assembling everything he had: maps of the trench, photographs of the conduit, notes on the HOA's permit violations, and now, images of the toxic tanks they had found beneath the shed. It was a damning collection of evidence, but he knew presenting it outright would be risky. The HOA board, led by the slippery Douglas Harper, would likely claim ignorance or try to spin the situation to avoid liability. Instead, Graham decided to force their hand. He began drafting a formal complaint to the County Environmental Protection Agency. With the evidence he had, it would be impossible for them to ignore the issue. If the HOA was illegally handling hazardous materials or engaging in improper waste disposal, the county would launch an investigation, and that would bring the entire operation to a halt. But before submitting the complaint, Graham needed to test the waters. That evening, he attended another HOA meeting, this time with Linda at his side. The room was tense, as word of Graham's previous confrontation had spread among the neighbors. People whispered as he entered, and even Douglas Harper's polished demeanor seemed slightly strained as he greeted the attendees. When the floor opened for public comments, Graham stood and addressed the room. "Once again, I'm here to talk about the trench project," he began, his voice steady. "But this time, I'm not here to ask questions. I'm here to warn you." The murmurs grew louder, but Graham pressed on. "I've been investigating this project for weeks, and what I've found is deeply troubling. The trench isn't for flood mitigation, as we've been told. It's being used to install industrial-grade conduit connected to a hazardous site at the edge of our neighborhood. This isn't speculation, it's fact, and I have the evidence to prove it." Harper's expression darkened. "Mr. Lawson, these baseless accusations are starting to border on defamation. I would advise you to choose your words carefully." "Defamation?" Graham shot back. "Would you like to explain the tanks I found beneath the shed on the fence lot? Or the Hazmat markings on the conduit your contractors have been burying? Because if you won't, I'm sure the County Environmental Protection Agency will." The room fell silent. Harper's composure cracked for a fraction of a second before he forced a tight smile. "I don't know what you think you found, but I can assure you the HOA is acting within its rights. Any further disruptions will result in fines and legal action against you, Mr. Lawson." Graham smirked. "Go ahead, but when the inspectors come, let's see how long that smug attitude lasts." With that, he turned and left the room, Linda following close behind. As they walked into the cool night air, she glanced at him nervously. "You think he's bluffing?" "Doesn't matter," Graham said. "The complaint goes out tomorrow." The next morning, Graham filed a formal complaint with the County Environmental Protection Agency, attaching every piece of evidence he had collected. He also sent copies to a trusted environmental lawyer he had worked with during his engineering career, ensuring the complaint couldn't be buried or ignored. Days passed with no word from the county, but Graham knew these things took time. In the meantime, he noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. The construction crews became less visible, working sporadically and only under cover of darkness. The whole newsletter, usually filled with mundane updates, contained thinly veiled warnings about unruly homeowners disrupting progress. And one night, Graham noticed a black SUV parked down the street, its occupants lingering longer than seemed normal. Then, finally, the county inspectors arrived. They showed up unannounced, armed with clipboards, cameras, and a mandate to investigate the complaint. Graham watched from his porch as they questioned the construction crews and began inspecting the trench. Within hours, they moved on to the fenced lot, cutting through the same gate Graham and Linda had breached days earlier. By evening, the inspectors had finished their preliminary investigation, but their grim expressions told Graham everything he needed to know. The next day, he received a phone call from one of the inspectors, confirming his suspicions. The tanks beneath the shed contained hazardous waste, likely remnants of the chemical plant that had once occupied the site. The HOA had not only failed to report the presence of these materials, they had actively concealed them, risking contamination of the surrounding area. The fallout was swift and brutal. The county issued a cease and desist order, halting all construction and launching a full-scale investigation into the HOA's activities. Douglas Harper, who had always carried himself with smug authority, was suddenly nowhere to be found. Rumors swirled that he had resigned and left town to avoid facing the consequences. For Graham, the victory was bittersweet. He had exposed the truth and protected the neighborhood, but the damage to his property and his peace of mind couldn't be undone so easily. The trench remained a scar across his yard, a reminder of the battle he had fought. But as his neighbors began to rally around him, offering their support and gratitude, Graham felt a flicker of hope. One evening, as he stood at the edge of the trench, he noticed Linda walking over. She handed him a bottle of beer and smiled. "You did it," she said simply. "We did it," Graham replied, clinking his bottle against hers. The battle with the HOA might have been over, but Graham knew the fight for accountability was far from finished. The scars on the neighborhood would take time to heal, but he was ready to help rebuild one step at a time. In the weeks following the county's intervention, the neighborhood slowly began to recover from the chaos the HOA had wrought. The construction crews disappeared almost overnight, leaving the trenches abandoned and the project in limbo. County investigators worked methodically, dismantling the remnants of the operation and documenting every violation they uncovered. The fenced lot, once shrouded in secrecy, was now an open site of investigation, with Hazmat teams carefully extracting the tanks and testing the surrounding soil for contamination. For Graham, it felt like both a victory and a burden. The truth was out, and the HOA's deception had been exposed, but the scars they'd left behind, both literal and figurative, would take time to fade. His backyard was still a mess, a jagged wound where his garden and trees had once thrived. The sense of security and peace he'd sought when moving to the neighborhood seemed like a distant memory. The HOA, meanwhile, was in complete disarray. With Douglas Harper gone, the board struggled to maintain even the semblance of order. The remaining members resigned en masse as public outrage grew, leaving the organization effectively leaderless. Residents, many of whom had initially been passive or skeptical of Graham's efforts, now rallied together to demand accountability. A special meeting was held to dissolve the existing HOA structure and elect new leadership, with Graham and Linda, both nominated to oversee the transition. Though reluctant at first, Graham eventually agreed to take on the role, recognizing the importance of rebuilding trust within the community. "If we're going to have an HOA," he said at the meeting, "it needs to work for the people who live here, not against them." His words were met with applause, a stark contrast to the skepticism and hostility he'd faced just weeks earlier. The cleanup of the hazardous waste was slow but thorough. County officials assured residents that the contamination hadn't spread beyond the fenced lot, though the revelation of how close they had come to disaster left many uneasy. Graham stayed closely involved in the process, leveraging his engineering background to help ensure that proper protocols were followed. He also worked with Linda and a group of neighbors to petition for stricter oversight of HOA activities at the state level, hoping to prevent similar abuses in other communities. One afternoon, as the last of the toxic tanks was hauled away, Graham stood at the edge of the trench in his backyard. It felt strangely quiet without the constant noise of construction, but the silence was welcome. Linda joined him, carrying a set of blueprints she'd picked up from a local contractor. "You're really going through with it?" she asked, glancing at the plans. "Why not?" Graham said, smiling faintly. "If they're going to leave me with a trench, I might as well make it useful. The blueprints detailed a plan to turn the ruined backyard into something new, a terraced garden with a rainwater collection system, a nod to the very flood mitigation the HOA had pretended to care about. It would be a long project, but Graham liked the idea of transforming the mess into something productive, something that reflected his own resilience. As the neighborhood began to move on, Graham noticed subtle changes in the way people interacted. Neighbors who had barely exchanged a word before now stopped to chat, sharing updates on their lives and offering to help with each other's yards. The shared experience of exposing the HOA's corruption had forged a sense of community that hadn't existed before. The first official act of the new HOA board was to implement sweeping reforms. Transparency became the cornerstone of the organization, with regular updates, open meetings, and detailed financial reports shared with all residents. Graham and Linda also spearheaded an effort to audit the HOA's past activities, uncovering additional instances of mismanagement and questionable spending. By the end of the year, the neighborhood felt like a different place. The scars left by the trench were healing, both physically and emotionally. Graham's backyard was slowly coming together, and the apple trees he'd planted months ago were showing signs of new growth. It wasn't the future he'd envisioned when he first moved in, but in some ways, it was better a future he had fought for, one rooted in accountability, resilience, and the strength of a community united. On a cool autumn evening, Graham hosted a small gathering in his backyard, inviting the neighbors who had stood by him through the ordeal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, he raised a glass and looked around at the group. "To new beginnings," he said simply. The neighbors echoed his toast, their voices warm with gratitude and camaraderie. For the first time in months, Graham felt at peace. The battle had been long and grueling, but it had been worth it. He had fought not just for himself, but for everyone who called the neighborhood home. And in the end, they had won.